This story is a depiction of folklore and based on true events. Victor and John had met on a crisp and clear day in the Alaskan wilderness. Both men were out hunting, searching for game to sustain them through the long winter months. As they moved through the dense forest, they heard a rustling in the underbrush. Both men reached for their rifles, ready to take down whatever animal had been foolish enough to cross their path. When they emerged from the trees, they were surprised to see that they had both been after the same moose. There was a tense moment as they both aimed their rifles at the animal, neither man wanting to back down. But then, John lowered his rifle and motioned for Victor to take the shot. He knew that the moose would provide more than enough food for both of them, and he was willing to share the bounty. Victor nodded his thanks and took the shot, taking down the moose with a single, well-placed bullet. As they worked together to field-dress the animal and load it onto John's pack horse, the two men struck up a conversation. They quickly realized that they had a lot in common, and a deep and lasting friendship was formed. In that moment, Victor knew that he had found a true friend and ally in the Alaskan wilderness. Together, they braved the harsh and unforgiving land, always looking out for one another and supporting each other in their endeavors. John and Victor were two well-seasoned hunters, so when the opportunity presented itself to track down the legendary moose of the north, they knew they had to take it. The moose was said to possess antlers so massive that they could support the weight of a grown man, and its meat was rumored to be the most succulent and flavorful in all of Alaska. For years, hunters had tried and failed to bring down the elusive beast, but John and Victor were determined to succeed where so many others had failed. As they set out on their hunt, they packed only the essentials: their rifles, ammunition, and a few days' worth of food and supplies. They knew that the journey ahead would be long and treacherous, and they were prepared for whatever challenges lay ahead. As they made their way into the dense forests of the north, they were filled with a sense of excitement and determination. They knew that this hunt would be their greatest challenge yet, but they were ready for anything the wilderness might throw their way. As John and Victor tracked the legendary moose through the dense forests and snowy mountains of Alaska, they faced many challenges. The cold was perhaps the greatest of these challenges, as the temperature dropped lower and lower with each passing day. Despite the thick layers of clothing they wore, the two hunters could still feel the icy fingers of the cold creeping through their garments, numbing their fingers and toes and sapping their strength. They huddled close to their campfires at night, trying to draw what little warmth they could from the flickering flames. But it wasn't just the cold that made the hunt so difficult. There were countless other challenges as well, from treacherous terrain to fierce storms to encounters with other dangerous animals. Despite it all, John remained focused and determined, always searching for the next clue that would lead them closer to their quarry. He was a master tracker, and he knew all the signs to look for: the freshness of the tracks, the patterns of movement, the way the animal had disturbed the surrounding vegetation. With each step, he led Victor deeper into the wilderness, always following the moose's tracks with a hunter's keen eye. And as the days passed, they both knew that they were getting closer and closer to their goal. After weeks of tracking the legendary moose through the dense forests and snowy mountains of Alaska, John and Victor finally caught sight of their quarry. It was a cold and clear day, and the two hunters had just crested a rise when they saw the moose, its massive antlers glinting in the sunlight. For a moment, they stood there, frozen in awe at the sight of the magnificent beast. It was even larger and more majestic than they had imagined, and they could hardly believe that they had finally found it. But then, the moose caught sight of them, and it let out a fierce bellow, its massive antlers crashing through the underbrush as it charged at them. John and Victor stood their ground, their rifles at the ready. They knew that this was their one chance to bring down the beast, and they couldn't afford to miss. As the moose bore down on them, they took careful aim, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The animal was getting closer and closer, its antlers gleaming in the sunlight, and John and Victor knew that they had only seconds left to act. They held their breath, their fingers tight on the triggers of their rifles, as the moose charged towards them. This was the moment they had been waiting for, the moment they had dreamed of for years. And they were ready. As the legendary moose charged towards John and Victor, the two hunters stood their ground, their rifles at the ready. They knew that this was their one chance to bring down the beast, and they couldn't afford to miss. But as the moose closed in on them, John's shot went wide, the bullet harmlessly embedding itself in a tree trunk. Victor's shot struck the moose in the neck, causing it to violently flail and thrash about. The moose let out a series of guttural bellows, the sound echoing through the forest. Its eyes rolled back in its head, and it fell to the ground, its massive antlers embedding themselves in the earth. As John and Victor approached the beast, they could see the pain and fear in its eyes. They had never meant to cause the animal such suffering, but their shot had gone awry, and there was nothing they could do to save it. For what seemed like an eternity, they watched as the moose struggled to breathe, its life slowly ebbing away. They knew that they should end its suffering and put it out of its misery, but they couldn't bring themselves to pull the trigger. Finally, with a final, pitiful bellow, the moose drew its last breath and lay still. John and Victor stood there, shaken and horrified by what they had done. They had never meant to cause the animal such suffering, and they knew that they would carry the guilt of this moment with them for the rest of their lives. As they set to work field dressing the moose and preparing it for the long journey back to their camp, they did so in silence, the weight of their actions heavy on their shoulders. It was a grueling task, made all the more difficult by the knowledge that they had caused the animal such pain and suffering. As the sun began to set, they finished their work and set out for home, the moose meat and antlers weighing heavy on their backs. They knew that they had a long and difficult journey ahead, but they were filled with a sense of sorrow and regret that they had never known before. As John and Victor set out for home, they knew that they had a long and difficult journey ahead of them. The cold and wet Alaskan wilderness was a harsh and unforgiving place, and they would have to use all of their skills and strength to survive the journey. At first, everything seemed to be going well. They made good progress through the dense forests and over the snowy mountains, always keeping an eye out for any signs of danger. But then, as they were making their way down a steep hill, Victor slipped and fell, his foot twisting beneath him with a sickening crunch. John rushed to his side, and as he saw the pain and fear in his friend's eyes, he knew that something was seriously wrong. He quickly set to work, doing his best to patch up Victor's injured ankle. It was a painful and difficult process, and Victor cried out in agony as John worked to splint and bandage the injury. Despite the pain, Victor refused to give up, and he gritted his teeth and bore the agony with a stoic determination. He knew that they had to keep moving if they wanted to survive, and he was willing to do whatever it took to get home. In the end, John's makeshift splint seemed to do the trick, and with Victor leaning heavily on his shoulder, they set out once again, determined to make it back to camp before nightfall. But as the sun began to set, they knew that they wouldn't make it. Exhausted and battered, they set up camp for the night, huddling close to their campfire as the cold and wet of the Alaskan wilderness closed in around them. As John and Victor huddled around their campfire, trying to stay warm and dry in the cold and wet Alaskan wilderness, they were startled by a strange noise in the darkness. At first, they thought it was just the wind, or perhaps an animal rustling through the underbrush. But as the noise grew louder and more persistent, they knew that something was wrong. They could sense an ominous presence in the darkness, something powerful and dangerous that was stalking them from the shadows. John grabbed his rifle and stood up, trying to see what was out there. But all he could see was darkness, and the only sound was the pounding of his own heart. "It's a bear," he whispered to Victor, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can feel it. They've got the best noses in the business, you know. They can smell a single drop of blood from miles away." Victor nodded, his face pale in the flickering light of the campfire. He had heard the stories of bears in the Alaskan wilderness, and he knew that they were powerful and dangerous animals. For what seemed like an eternity, they sat there, waiting and listening as the bears circled their camp. They knew that they should do something, but they were too afraid to move. They just sat there, huddled together and praying that the bear would go away. As John and Victor set out for home once again, the bear was still on their tail, stalking them from the shadows. They knew that they had to move fast if they wanted to escape, but with Victor's injury weighing him down, it was a struggle to maintain their pace. Despite the pain and exhaustion, Victor refused to give up. He gritted his teeth and kept moving, driven by a fierce determination to survive. But as they stumbled through the dense forests and across the snowy mountains, the bear seemed to be everywhere. They could hear its panting breath and the rustle of its fur in the underbrush, always just out of sight. Then, just as they were crossing a small stream, Victor collapsed. His ankle was throbbing with pain, and he could go no further. John tried to help him up, but it was too late. The bear came out of the shadows, its massive jaws bared and its eyes glowing with a fierce hunger. John raised his rifle and fired 3 shots in rapid succession, trying to scare the bear away. But the beast was too powerful, and it charged at Victor, its massive paws thrashing about as it tried to tear him apart. Victor screamed as the bear mauled his face and back, tearing at his flesh with its sharp claws. The pain was unbearable, and he begged John to end his misery. With tears streaming down his face, John knew that there was only one thing left to do. He raised his rifle one last time and pulled the trigger, putting Victor out of his misery. As the bear retreated into the bushes, John collapsed beside his friend's body, overwhelmed by grief and regret. Dawn turned to dusk, and dusk to dawn. The cold, bitter wind bellowed through the trees. John was never heard of again. What do you think happened to John? We would love to hear from you in the comments. Please be sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed.